Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a live episode of Race Matters because race does matter. And
Yes.
today is Thursday, June the 23rd, 2022. And we have another great show for you tonight with our special guest joining us again for part two of racial trauma. But now we're talking about racial trauma with Dr. Randolph Walters. And we are so excited to have him back in the studio for part two. This is a three-part series. It might be more than three parts, so stay tuned. But we know it's three parts right now. So we want to welcome Dr. Walters back to the show tonight.
Yes.
Joining us, Dr. Walters. We got so much great feedback, Dr. Walters, from you being on the show the first time and a lot of viewers and subscribers. So I thank you guys so much for enjoying the dialogue that we have with Dr. Walters because it's so important. This information, racial trauma and healing racial trauma, is extremely important because we all deal with some form, I use all loosely, some forms of trauma, and especially people of color dealing with racial trauma. But where there's trauma, there needs to be healing. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, healing racial trauma. And I want to say a thank you to my lovely co-hosts, Rosie and Mariana. Hello, ladies.
Hey.
So we're going to get started, but before we do, subscribe to the channel, like the page, and like the video, and please share the feed if you would like some friends and family to watch from your page because maybe they don't know about Full Life Communications. But please share your comments on the feed so we can and questions so we can get your questions answered, hopefully by Dr. Walters or one of the hosts. And we love to engage with you because it's not just about us; it's about the engagement.
Yes.
So please put your comments and questions in the feed. And without further ado, we're going to start right now. Dr. Walters, can you give our audience a brief recap of racial trauma and then get into the beginnings of what you want to discuss regarding healing racial trauma?
Well, thank you so much, Sharon, Rosie, and Mariana, for having me. I had a wonderful time last 2 weeks ago, and I'm really delighted to be back. This is really important to me. I define ministry simply as touching people. So any opportunity I have to be able to share what God has downloaded in me and what I've studied and observed, I'm certainly glad to do that. So this is a pleasure to be here, and welcome to all of you who are listening and who gave comments and so on. So last time we talked about trauma. I defined trauma firstly as a psychological wound, a psychic wound. It's a scar. I talked about the fact that trauma is not an illness, it is an injury. So the question we will always want to ask is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Also, when we think about events that are overwhelming to us, to our psyche, we each have a capacity to manage and to cope. But there are things that happen to us that are overwhelming and flood us, and we develop symptoms. So trauma really comes from a Greek word that means wound. So the same way we think about wounds in a physical sense, we think about emotional and psychological wounds. So when we talk about racial trauma, we're really talking about the stress and symptoms that people of color experience as a result of racialized experiences. And we can have those that are individualistic, like being pulled over by a white police officer or other kinds of things. We talked about microaggressions that are very passive aggressive ways of devaluing and invalidating experiences of Black folk and other people of color. And is as a result of that, we're also talking about generational trauma, and we're talking about systemic racism, because when we look at racism, it's not simply individual experiences, something you encounter on the street, in the supermarket, at your workplace, but we're talking about in the system itself. And so people of color experience tremendous stress and become symptomatic. Racial trauma in terms of diagnosis does not appear in the DSM-5. There have been some recent attempts in the new edition that came out in March 2022 to really focus a bit more on experiences of race. But individuals who experience traumatic events or difficult and overwhelming events as a result of racialized experiences do and can meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So we talked about that. We talked a lot about some of the symptoms. So today I want to really get into healing racial trauma. And I'm going to attempt to do this in two parts, maybe three. We'll see how the conversation goes tonight, because there's so much that I want to share with you, so much that's on my mind. And I'm very excited to be here with these three wonderful women. And so I want to begin by, when we talk about healing racial trauma, it's important to talk about who we are as individuals. So here's the thing I want you to get first. That when we think about us as human beings, all human beings, we're spirit. We're spirit, we live in a body, and we have a soul.
Yes.
We're spirit, essentially, that comes from God. We're a spirit. We live in our body. Our body is just the temple. It is the house. We live in a body and we have a soul. And I want to talk about soul in a minute. And so from my perspective, if we want to talk about healing racial trauma, we have to be holistic. So we have to talk about healing the spirit, that part of us that connects us with God. We have to talk about healing the soul or mind. I'm going to break that down in a minute. And we have to talk about healing the body. And I want to get more into the body next week. So we have to address all three areas of healing. We can't talk about healing racial trauma, and we're just talking about emotional, psychological stuff, right?
Right.
And so we're going to be talking about these three components that make up all of who human beings are. Mm-hmm. We're body, we're soul, or in another sense, we can talk about mind, and we are spirit. So when we talk about soul and mind, body, and spirit, mind, body, and soul, whatever term you use, the term soul, which occurs a lot in Christian theology, really, when you study the word soul, you go back to the Old Testament and the Hebrews, who had a lot to say about soul. It really comes from a Hebrew word called leba. Leba is the idea of heart. And when you look at the Old Testament carefully, you'll see a lot of references to the heart and God being in the heart of man. Jeremiah says is deceitful.
Yeah, that hit my mind when you said
soul is our heart is soul. Is that part? Soul is really that part that we study in psychology. So I spend a lot of time with students teaching about soul, how to handle soul and what soul is. In another sense, that word soul from the Greek word, there was a Greek goddess called Psyche. Psyche is the Greek goddess. And that's from which we get the word psychology, right? So psychology is soulish stuff. It's all about the soul. And the soul is that part of us that essentially connects us with our personality. The soul really involves our thoughts, our emotions, our will, right? That's the essential part. Soul is not spirit. There are connections, right? And so there is a general understanding when we look at Hebrew tradition, and we go into the Greeks, that when we talk about soul, we're talking about areas of the will involving our feelings, our emotions, and our thought life. That's what we're talking about. So, having said that, then, when we think about healing racial trauma, I like us to invite us to think about 4 different levels of healing. So we can talk about individual healing, and I'll be talking a lot about that, but also healing in families, and we have to heal in communities, right? And then the 4th layer is systems, right? Institution and systems, because systems create trauma. And we know, despite that there are many individuals who attack the whole idea of systemic or institutional racism, it does exist. And so there is bias, there's racism in a system. There's racism in a society, as a matter of fact, in the United States, embedded in the system, embedded in many institutions, embedded in the law, is racism that is undergirded or emerges out of white supremacy, which is a whole nother conversation. that I'm not going to get into in detail. And so if we're talking about healing racial trauma, we have to think about individual healing, that each of us have to be healed. But how do we heal families, right? So we're moving out individual families. How do we heal communities? So we can talk about a church community, you know, or a community of believers in Islam, you know, or whatever tradition, faith tradition. And how do we heal communities? How do we heal and work at systems to change systems and to bring about, you know, transformation that brings about healing, where essentially people are changed and there are systems that involve a greater sense of justice and fairness, and people feel included, because that's what institutional racism does to individuals. So what we're going to be focusing on today, it's more soul, spirit healing. And in our next session, I'll talk about the body, all right, even though it's difficult to really pull one from the other. One of the critical things about medicine in the West, where we are, is that we've fragmented stuff too much, right? Has really taught us much better, because they do a better job of integrating mind and body. And that's why when we have to work on that, and we're doing more of it, a lot of it has really filtered into psychology. Where do we go? We have to go to the East when we think about, you know, meditation and all of those things. They do a better job connecting mind and body. We fragment. So a patient goes to the doctor and they have symptoms, and the doctor will give them some medication and may not say, well, I think you should talk to a therapist. And they come to a therapist, and we don't have conversation. Why is the doctor not talking to the therapist? And why is the therapist not talking to the doctor?
Right.
Why is the therapist not talking to the psychiatrist if there's one, and so on? That the system is fragmented so much. And I think it's because we put so much emphasis on the physical, on the body, and not enough emphasis on soul.
Right.
We have this disparity in the system between the physical health and mental health. And so there's not enough investment when we look at insurance companies. There's not parity in mental and physical health, that we put an overemphasis on our physical illness and disease, but not enough on soul, not enough on our psyche. And it's embedded in how we do things. And for example, people getting sick leave, or the number of sessions we give a year, insurance companies provide, that we don't value in the same way, that there's so much emphasis on body, and there's not enough emphasis on our emotional hygiene. What's going on with us? What's going on inside us? We cannot separate the two. And we do know that there are oftentimes people become symptomatic, and in racial trauma, this happens a lot. And it comes out in the body because the body doesn't lie. And there's what we call psychosomatic illness.
Right.
The individual has physical symptoms, but there's no physical reason. So if we focus on spirit, right, and we don't look at body and mind, then we have a disconnect. And some of our Christian traditions like to focus a lot on spirit, and they don't pay attention to the mind, right? There's some sense in some traditions where going to the academy is seen as, you know, that's not the thing to do. You just focus on spirit, right? And I just tell you that everything is not spiritual.
Right.
That are just foolish, that are just psychological. That person needs to see a therapist. They need to address some emotional issues, some abuse or stuff in their past. And sometimes they just need some medication.
And you know, Dr. Waters, it's my pastor. She said, she broke it down one time, and I loved when she said it. She said, you know, we talk about disease in the body, but it starts with dis-ease. She said, if you break down disease, it's dis-ease. And when some kind of traumatic experience is happening to you, then all of a sudden you find yourself at the doctor's office because you're having symptoms of different things going on in your blood pressure, or sometimes they say a person's leukemia came on after they had a traumatic experience, and she says disease is broken. If you break it down, it comes from dis-ease. And when you have dis-ease, then all of a sudden you're dealing with medical issues. You're on medication. You're going to your doctor. They can't find out what's wrong with you because it started in the mind. It started with the stress and everything what you're going through, and then all of a sudden it started to manifest physically.
Yeah. Wow. We can go to scripture that says, as a person thinks in their heart. So we see back to that word heart, right? That soulish, that mind, that psyche, right? That our mind is where the battlefield is. And I'm going to be talking, hopefully I can get to it tonight, the whole idea of tending to the mind. Go ahead, Mariana.
Yeah, so as you were sharing all of that, like where my mind was also going to is at the same time seeing a lot of the progress that Black communities have made, oftentimes with a lot of pushback. So when I think of like a lot of the like Black culture and more like white culture, a lot of the whites are also more individualist. So even though last week we talked about, white people might be more likely to go to therapy, but we're disconnected oftentimes from communities. They think that part of the reason why people of color have been resilient and have experienced a lot of growth has been because of community, both like spiritual and then as well as within the families and such, because there's an emphasis on big families and supporting each other and faith within communities of color.
Well, that's absolutely right. I would say the answer to that is yes. Essentially, people of color, and whether you talk about African Americans or whether you talk about, let's talk about Native Americans, or let's talk about Asian Americans or Hispanic Americans. Essentially, BIPOC individuals come out of more collectivist, what we call collectivist culture. And collectivist culture emphasize the group and not so much the individual. So the notion, I think I mentioned last time, of I am because we are. We know that a fundamental philosophical foundation of American society is rugged individualism, which the focus is on the individuals, that you can do better if you just get motivated, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yes.
About the self. And I think that those of us from the diaspora, whether we are in the United States or the Caribbean or South America, Central America, I mentioned earlier, it may be off here, I don't remember, Sharon, that we came on the same slave ship, right? But we come from cultures that are essentially collectivist, where the focus is in Africa is on the family, on the tribe. That collectivist nature, I think, is so embedded, is what I like to call African retentions. And slavery has done a job on us. All right? Slavery has done a job on us. And Jim Crow and all that has done a job on us. And we're still struggling. Post-traumatic slavery syndrome, as Dr. Guri would describe it. However, the Black family has been resilient. And I think there are a lot of embedded in our culture and how we think as being part of the African retention, that when people migrate or when they are taken to other parts of the world, to any other region, that there are aspects of their culture that they retain. And I think that deep sense of collectivism, that deep sense of family is rooted, but also the deep sense of spirituality. We know that the Black church, what we call the Black church, really emerged and grew out of the Jim Crow period. And there was no place for Black people to worship because they weren't allowed to go to white churches. And so the church, the Black church, has been a significant institution in Black communities in this country as a means of support, not just spiritual place, but a sense of identity. The Black church, I'm going to make a statement here. it might or might not be controversial, that the Black church is the one institution that has not really been infiltrated by white society or white individuals. The Black church is the one institution that has been able to maintain its a sense of purity and its culture, and it's very significant in Black communities, especially in urban communities. So yes, I think those are fundamental foundations that has been part of what I'll talk about later, the idea of resilience that has helped us to be able to bounce back and to survive. Because what trauma does is it leads to a kind of disconnection. Trauma disconnects us, and we disconnected from our bodies, and oftentimes we have other kinds of disconnections. We know, for example, that one of the symptoms of trauma, severe trauma, individuals have dissociative experiences where they can actually leave their body in emotional and psychological sense. And when people get triggered, they have triggering experiences like flashbacks as a result of a traumatic experience, they can dissociate. All right. So we have dissociation. And so some of us in Black bodies, we know ways of dissociating, of disconnecting. We've learned how to do that. Yeah. And sometimes we call it code switching. All right. So the term code switching, which if you're African American, you know what I'm talking about. But there's an element of code switching on what that might be that has a dissociative piece of it in terms of learning how to exist in one environment and then how to disconnect and how to move in and out. And then there's the desensitization, which is important for us to heal, because we need to be able to connect with our bodies and connect with our mind and connect with our spirit. And so I may have mentioned this last week. It is important to understand that as human beings, we're fundamentally wired for two things. One, we are wired for survival. So human beings are incredible. You hear stories of people who have incredible experiences and they're able to bounce back. In 2000, I was in Rwanda, and it was, I don't know if I told the story last time. I seem to be having a little deja vu, but I've told this story so many times. I was just amazed 6 years after the genocide at Rwandans and people's ability to be able to survive and to talk about what had happened in something that was terrible, that we survive. And one of the things that was very clear to me then is the power of the human spirit, I call it. And so we have an incredible ability to survive, but we're also hardwired for connection, for relationships. That's fundamental. And when we emphasize relationships have a curative element that I want to engage us in. And so trauma does that, and it disrupts the sense of attachment and connection, and it forces us to find ways to survive. Unfortunately, without healing, we tend to go to different ways of healing that keeps us in the disconnection area.
Yes.
Right? That when we're traumatized, we all have our Hakuna Matata land.
Right.
We go to this place where we think there's no worry, and we want to escape. And healing trauma involves confrontation, because we cannot conquer what we do not confront. And we have to be willing at some point to revisit. As a matter of fact, when you look at the research and the clinical data, all of the cutting edge treatments for trauma in therapy, and when I say cutting edge, the top tier treatments, the treatments that we would call our evidence-based, or another fancy term, empirically validated, meaning that the research shows that these treatments work, that people in fact do get better. The cutting edge treatments for trauma all involve some element of exposure. And that says something, that there's a principle of healing that involves revisiting and going and confronting stuff. I'm going to talk about that later in a very important concept in terms of how we heal that is rooted in African culture actually came out of Ghana. And so trauma distorts our image of ourselves. So healing, one of the fundamental things that need to happen in healing is our sense of self. That racial trauma has disrupted a sense of self, that sometimes we can carry this deep sense that something is wrong with us and that we don't belong. And America has a really excellent way of making, or triggering rather, because sometimes I argue that nobody can make you do anything, but it evokes that America does an excellent job in creating a context that people of color feel over and over like they don't belong. And so how do we spend years in this country and work hard and pay taxes and contribute, and then you create laws to prevent us from voting, to prevent us to the polls, as is happening right now. And so the constant question is, do we belong? Racial trauma disrupts that, and many of us feels at the core worthless, rejected. We have to build this country, but yet you treat us like we don't belong here. We feel abandoned. Those are deep things, these conflicted emotions we have, that we love America, but America doesn't. Who was it that says that we
doesn't love us back?
The coach of the Sixers, right? 2020 made a very passionate speech. We love America, says, but America doesn't love us back. Oh goodness, just think about what that must feel like. Talk about invalidation, feelings of guilt and fear, a disconnection from community. And for many people of color, they've disconnected from communities, and we see that unfortunately in voting patterns. There are many African Americans who do not go to the polls because they feel disconnected from the larger society, and they respond in ways to the systemic racism.
Yes.
And they don't participate. And of course, that doesn't help us. But there we are, unless healing happens.
Right.
You'll hear them say, my vote doesn't matter because of that conditioning, right? That you're talking about.
And I don't see anything that changes my mind, because when I listen to the news, I see one more Black man being murdered. And there's a loss too sometimes of faith. That disconnection, that loss of connection and community can filter into a deep existential sense and disconnection from God, and a sense of betrayal. And so when we talk about healing, if we're going to heal and connect spiritually, we have to do the emotional, the psychological, the soulish. Let me say this. This is a fundamental principle. I believe that we do not heal spiritually or grow spiritually beyond our emotional and psychological growth. Let me say that again. I believe that we do not grow spiritually beyond our emotional and psychological growth. And so there are a lot of folk who go to church, or they go to the masjid or wherever they worship, and they've been there for years, but they're not growing. They're not growing like they should because of the stuff, right? They have some psychological stuff. Maybe there's some abuse in the past. There's some trauma. There's some generational trauma. There's some experiences of racial trauma that they haven't dealt with, and their growth is stunted. The story I love, Jesus tells the story of the parable of the sower. I like to call it the parable of the soils, because he's talking about different kinds of soils. And here's what he said. Watch this. There's some that fell, some of the seed, when the sower went out to sow and to plant, fell on good ground, but the thorns came and choked. The soil was good, but the thorns. And then he translated what that means. And he says, there are those who hear the word and receive it with gladness. So there are those folk that are very diligently, and in Christian tradition, in the Black church and church, wherever you worship, these are the individuals who on Sunday are screaming at the word. You know, preach, and they're excited.
Yes.
They're receiving the word with gladness. But they walk out of there on Sunday and they go back to their life. And here's what Jesus says: but the cares of the world and the pursuit of which is the word. What are the cares of the world? The stress and all the stuff that we have, soulish stuff, choke the word. So it's possible to be getting good word every Sunday. And I believe that there's good word in churches all across Philadelphia. They're good preachers in this city and all across the state of Pennsylvania, and indeed all over the U.S. But people leave, they're not growing like they should because there's stuff. There's stuff they have to do with. That's the soulish piece. And that's why we can't attempt to just address spirit, right?
Right.
So the needs to work in tandem with the professional counselors and psychiatrists and psychologists, as not just, you know, the church doing it itself, right? Like I said, this is more of a holistic approach. So when you have resources, right? So say that the pastor has resources and they can, when you know, some congregants come to them for counseling that's out of their purview, right? They say, well, listen, I have some resources for you because this is who this church may connect with, because we work in tandem, because we know it's not just spirit, it's soul as well. And when we work together holistically, right, we can then grow spiritually, just like you're saying.
And what Dr. Waters had triggered me, Sharon, if you remember, our pastor did a service on trapped by an event.
Yeah, she did on trauma.
And the thing is, some of us are trapped by so many events. You know, so you can deal with one, but there's so much more. And growing up in Black community, you're not taught to deal with those things. I mean, if you ever went to talked about going getting help, and then you're weak, you're this and you're so you have a compounded. You have
in the Lord.
Right. You have a compounded events. You're not trapped by just an event, but multiple events that you have covered up because you felt if you revealed it, it either showed your weakness or it revealed something about you. So you have a compounded events that are trapping you. And even though you may get a word, like you said, it may free you for that moment. But then when you get back in your environment, it's like a drug addict. You go get help. You know, they get you off it, but then you go back to the community that you got hooked on.
Yes.
And you're expected to keep keep the fact that you just came off drugs. You're supposed to continue with that, but in an environment that is laden with drugs in your house, outside, the dealers are on your corner. Some of the dealers are your best friends. And so you can't be expected to keep that level of healing from that drug addiction if you're going to stay in the cesspool of events that put you there in the first place.
People, places, and things.
Exactly.
So here's part of the difficulty in terms of conflicted emotion. And I want to talk later about W.E. Du Bois. But so when we look at the Declaration of Independence, right? 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Watch this. That all men are created equal. That all men are created equal, right? And they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable simply means rights that cannot be taken. You didn't give them. They're given by God, by the virtue of being a creature in this earth. That you have these rights, these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so what racism and racial trauma does is it challenges our belief in that.
Right.
That is in fact true in the context of this society, that America is still struggling to live up to that creed. And so these repeated experiences and systemic experiences of trauma creates fundamental conflicts. Am I a citizen? Can I breathe?
Right.
Can I call out a white woman? Can I jog without being judged? There are fundamental questions that are raised that connects with our sense of dignity and humanity. And so I struggle then with, well, how do I exist and function in a society that sends messages to me about my sense of person and my sense of dignity? And I think about a bit of history thousands of years ago, where the children of Israel, so we have some similarities, were in exile. Because those of us from the diaspora, we're in exile. Right? We were forced to come to this region. The children of Israel were in exile. Remember those years they were in Babylon in exile. And the writer of Psalm 137 talks about that. All right. And says, the people said, well, they were asked, could you sing us songs? It's like, you're a black folk, you can sing, can you sing us songs? And the response was, how can we sing the songs of the Lord in a strange, a foreign land? I love Bob Marley's version of that. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down. And then he says, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? How do you expect us to sing while we're in captivity? They were watching, looking over and seeing their city in ruin as they were in captivity, and seeing Jerusalem in ruin. And that's I think, a fundamental question. And Habakkuk talks about that. And his how long do we have to endure injustice? How long? As the king using that text in Habakkuk. How long? Not long. How long? Not long. That's a fundamental question. And so for Black folk in particular, that creates not only disconnection, but deep, deep wounds as a result of the systemic nature of trauma. So I want to go on, and I'm going to look at about 6 things we need to do. I don't know if we get through all 6, but we're talking, right?
Right.
The first thing that we have to do is we have to make sense of our history and culture.
Right.
One of the ways we're going to heal is our culture, right? And I told you I'm a Marley fan. And so in one of Bob's songs, the one Rat Race, right? Bob says, don't forget your history. You know your destiny. In the abundance of water, the fool is thirsty. Rat race. Watch this. Don't forget your history. You know your destiny. In the abundance of water, imagine being in a river of water, a reservoir, and you're thirsty. There is something you're not getting, something you're missing. Don't forget your history. And here's one of the fundamental things that is critical to where we are, particularly for Black people in this country. All of the attack on the 1619 Project, which simply dates the beginning of slavery in this country, and the attacks on critical race theory, which most people that attack it don't even understand it or know what it is.
Absolutely.
It's a fundamental attack on our history.
Yes.
And all of the fight to not have it taught in schools. And by the way, CRT is not taught in school.
Right. I didn't hear about it until way past college.
Right. You're going to learn it in college, especially in law school for sure. And you might learn it in college. So there's an attack. We're saying don't teach this that we're teaching here and all of that stuff. And can I just say for all of the audience that Black history is American history.
Yes.
Black history is American history.
Yes.
So if we're going to heal, we have to embrace our history and our culture.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Not allow folk to hijack.
Mm-hmm.
We need to study history. We need to read.
Mm-hmm.
We need to celebrate and draw on those fundamental aspects of our culture that has helped us, that are strengths. Bob Marley talks about survivors and how we're survivors. All right. He says, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're survivors. And that goes back to the question you asked, Mariana. And so our history is significant. We have to celebrate our culture. We have to celebrate. And here I'm talking about a strengths-based approach. Focus on the strengths of our culture, and that is going to help us to build resilience in religious communities. We need to celebrate. We need to celebrate and acknowledge Juneteenth.
Yes, yes.
We did it on Sunday and celebrate it on Monday. We need to celebrate because communities foster growth. Celebrate our history and our culture. That's one of the ways we're going to heal and grow. That's the mind. All right. The importance of understanding.
Yes, the soulish realm. Yep.
Understanding. Watch this. Knowledge is important. And we say that knowledge is power. Yes, it is. But understanding is deeper than knowledge.
Yes.
Now, and not only that,
there are people that know you, but they may not understand you.
Right.
Oh, that's my story.
And the other side, Dr. Walters, is not only the knowledge, but the application of it, because you can have knowledge and be silent and never get it across. And as you talk about the songs of Bob Marley, there's one song that I love well, I love all his songs, but Stevie Wonder's called "The Black Man." And in that, he even says it, like he talks about, like, the first man who died for the flag we now hold high was a black man. And he goes on. But one of the parts, he says, we pledge our allegiance all of our lives toward the magic colors, red, blue, and white. But we all must be given the liberty that we defend, you know, for what justice is not for all men, you know. We have to learn this world was made for all men. And when he says that part, I mean, I was playing that song so much, especially, you know, when Barack Obama became president. I was like, yeah, we pledge allegiance. You know, I'm getting happy now, you know. But we have to understand that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but even while we're talking about this, something had come to mind to me before this show even started. But even with us, with the trauma that we have to deal with, and you can help me, you know, understand this or maybe relay it better. But a lot of times, a lot of people, and I question myself on asking this on here, because you get nervous of what you put out there, because you're not, like you said, some people are going to be like, oh, you know, she's just trying to make it a race issue. But a lot of white people don't understand that when a black person walks in a room, their ethnicity, their blackness doesn't come into play until they walk into an environment that forces them to recognize who they are because of how they're being seen by the other party. And on the flip side, white people don't understand how black people feel, because when we walk in the room, we're the ones feeling that we're marginalized, while you're looking at us saying, I wonder what they're doing here. Do they belong here? So you look at us a particular way and we feel it, and then we start questioning. That's when we recognize the most of our blackness, is because we walk into an environment and you're generating, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. You see, you know what I'm saying?
And think about the cumulative sense of that, right? That you have those experiences repeat, and what that does to you, to your sense of self. And that's why connecting with your history is so important. The next thing, number 2, in terms of how we heal, is that I want to talk about the importance of telling our story. Right? We have to be able to tell our story. And storytelling, which is really a strong tradition in African culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
We go back to the oral tradition, right?
Right.
So narratives, and we know from a psychological sense or therapeutic sense that narratives heal trauma. And so that's why, as I said earlier, one of the things we want to do, so in the context of therapy, someone comes in the office, one of the first things we want to say is, tell me what happened.
Yeah.
What's wrong with you? And we have to find places where we are able to tell our story. And that's why talk therapy, what we do mostly, is so curative. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
Freud calls psychoanalysis the talking cure. That there is a healing in talking. Actually, there's a
Yeah.
principle. I think I shared it last time. I'm having so many deja vus tonight. James 5:16, confess your sins that you may be healed, right? That's
Right. Right.
the talking, the telling.
Yeah.
So there's a spiritual principle there embedded in James 5:16, and there's the notion that in the telling, the confession, because confession there is simply telling. In my office, on my couch, I see what I do is a confessional. People come and tell their story, right?
Yes.
Storytelling. We got to be able to tell our story. Who was the greatest storyteller?
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus.
Lord.
All Jesus
My
did.
Lord.
He didn't
My
hoop
Lord.
and holler.
He spoke a lot in stories. Yeah.
He told stories, right? And so
Yes.
part of our healing will come in learning how to tell our story. Watch this. I love this African proverb. It says, until the lion has a voice, the story will be told by the hunter.
Mm-hmm.
Until the lion has a
Wow.
voice, the story will be told by the
By
hunter.
the hunter.
Because when the hunter goes out to hunt, the hunter will come back and tell the story from the hunter's perspective.
Right.
Right. Of course.
But once the lion has a voice, the lion can begin to tell the story from the lion's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to hear this fundamentally, that the attempts to not teach Black history, to not teach the experiences of Black folk in this country, to not teach the experiences of Native Americans, of Asian Americans,
Yes.
Hispanic Americans, to not teach diversity is an affront to the dignity. It's a soulish attempt because people, history, and the experiences, the stories are powerful and curative. And you're not for allow our brothers and sisters in white bodies to get the full picture. If you attack a story, how do you attack my story, my history? How do you say that's not to be taught?
Yeah.
We have a very distorted view of history. And what it does fundamentally, in a very subtle but not so subtle way, is it says that your story is invalidation. I'm going to talk about invalidation in a minute. It says that your story really don't matter.
Right.
With your story. All right. And to teach that is going to, but my story, there's no problem. You teach my story.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My story is better than the other. So, you know, I had someone say in reference to something I was doing on CRT, you know, on white supremacy. That's revisionist history. Well, of course, it's revisionist history because the first history was written from the hunter's perspective, if I can use that metaphor.
That is awesome.
So now we have the opportunity to tell history from the lion's perspective.
Right.
Now, in the Caribbean, here's the thing, and I keep feeling like I said this last time, that the history about emancipation, which came in 1834 in the English-speaking Caribbean, was a story that slaves were free because of the magnanimity of white people in Britain, William Wilberforce and all of those. And of course, they were part of the the abolitionist movement, really, that helped to push legislation in British Parliament for the emancipation of slaves. However, what the history did not say, it did not describe the other forces that were at work.
Exactly.
And history,
they did the heavy lifting, right?
Yes, it showed that prior to emancipation, there were a series of rebellions. The Black folk, the slaves were rising up, right? And there were economic forces as well. And that history gives a better picture of how those slaves became free.
Right.
So the story has to be told.
The whole story.
From the lion's perspective as well.
Right.
And so we can't heal if we are not able to tell story. And so I said we all need some couch moments.
Yes.
We all need some couch moments. There's nothing wrong with going and sitting on somebody's couch and talking about your racial story. And in this regard, of course, we need people who are culturally competent and sensitive.
That's good.
Trauma-informed or listening, right?
That's good.
And so there's an element of this we call narrative therapy. And in narrative therapy, what you do is the essential philosophy is that the person is the expert of their own lives and their story, right?
Wow, yeah.
And so there is a sanctity of a person's story. And then what it does is it removes blame and others' perception. It's so wonderful to go in an office and for 50 minutes, an hour, to be able to just tell your story, all right? And be able to re-experience and talk about your story. I'm Black, I'm beautiful, and I can do anything. You got to be able to tell your story, because it's in the telling that not only healing comes, but it's a recreation of a narrative that helps you to be able to make sense of your experiences.
Right.
And provide a foundation for healing. So storytelling, we have to have communities like we're doing now, where we can talk about our experiences with people who are similar.
Right.
In that sharing, we develop bonds and we create healing communities in storytelling. We need to reclaim that, which is a large part of our tradition. And one of the ways we do that, of course, is telling our story, our truth on somebody's couch.
Yeah.
The qualifications, though, they need to be culturally competent. They need to be
I love that. Culturally competent. I
from
love
my perspective. That's the right therapist for you. Someone who's culturally competent and trauma informed and tells stories. That's what it is, right? And if people are trauma informed, then they understand the power of storytelling, and they understand the healing that comes. They understand racial trauma. The third thing I want to say is, so we talk about embracing our history and culture. We talk about the importance of storytelling. The third thing is, I call it the importance of validation, right?
Oh, yes.
The power of validation. Here's what validation is. Validation says, I see you. I see you, Rosie. I see you, Mariana. Sharon, I hear you. Watch this. One of the deep fundamental truths and the deep fundamental need of the human heart is to be seen. Is to be heard. We all want to be seen. People go crazy when they're not seen. And I'm not talking about people who have issues with just needing attention. I'm not talking about the kind of attention that the narcissistic need to be seen, to feed an ego. I'm not talking about that. All right. I'm talking about a deep need to be gotten. Just listen carefully. You see David oftentimes struggling with that, not feeling heard by God, not feeling like God sees him, right? And part of validation then is this sense of understanding that our pain is part of this collective, that we're connected to our brothers and sisters, and there's a collective pain that we share. And so that's the telling of, that connection is the history, the telling of story. And when you are able to tell stories, even as we're telling tonight together, there's a sense of we are not alone.
Right.
That's why groups are so important. All right. When people come together and they're able to tell story, I'm Randolph Walters and I'm an alcoholic. Everybody said, hi, welcome. I'm Sharon Thomas and I'm an alcoholic. That there's something in that collectivity that gives us a sense that we are not alone. And what that does is that it validates our experience. That there's so much that is invalidating.
Right.
And when we invalidate, it really is an attack on the very foundation of who we are. It says that you're not really feeling that. Psychological invalidation says that I'm dismissing is when we dismiss people's experiences.
Yes.
The experiences of people of color. We reject their experiences, right? And we minimize their experiences. It implies that what you feel is not really important and it doesn't matter, it's wrong or unacceptable that you feel that. Your feelings are not unimportant. So here's how we do this. Here's a micro invalidation. When I say Black Lives Matter, you said Blue Lives Matter. All lives matter. You've missed it.
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely. From the beginning.
Because watch this. What you're saying is that when I say Black Lives Matter, I am saying that your life, white lives don't matter, or all lives don't matter. And that's not what I'm saying. You see why history is so important. Now, why do I have to say that Black Lives Matter?
Because it has felt like they didn't before.
You're treated like our lives don't matter.
So the point here is that when people say all lives matter as a retort or blue lives matter, that's a micro invalidation.
Yes.
Because what it is invalidating the experiences of Black people or other people of color. It's invalidating, right? So racism fundamentally is a form of invalidation. Nobody deserves to be invalidated, you know. That racial trauma leads people who walk around feeling constantly that their experiences are not real and that they're invalidating. And that creates, just think about the psychological stress. It's a kind of emotional abuse.
Absolutely. Gaslighting.
People's experience. Because what it does, it creates self-doubt. You know, have you ever like wondered, well, did I really feel that? Or did I just, maybe it's me. No. And we can start to convince ourselves that those things are not true.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Gaslighting, right?
And another word, Dr. Walters, is when the use of, okay, there you go, pulling the black card again. It's not that I'm trying to pull no black card. I see what you're doing to me right now. I recognize it. And then when I point it out, you get the fear of being deemed a racist. So you throw there you go, pulling the black card again. Well, I wouldn't have to pull it if you didn't shove my race in my face.
Yes.
Exactly.
I know I'm Black, and I don't need you to point that out to me by the way you're treating me.
But then your experience is invalidated. That's what I mean.
Exactly.
You know, children grow up in environments that are invalidating. It creates a lot of doubt.
Right.
All right. If you grow up in a home where your feelings weren't seen as valid, maybe you're told like, no, you shouldn't feel that, or you're not feeling that. You're told what to feel, and we see that in abusive families. Right?
Yes.
And so invalidation creates a lot of mental health problems. As a matter of fact, there is in the clinical literature belief that borderline personality disorder, which is a personality disorder that's very difficult to treat. That people have borderline personality disorder. Marshall Linehan, who developed the theory on looking at this, says that borderline personality disorder, that children grow up in environments that are invalidating.
Wow.
For development of her dialectic behavior therapy.
Right.
And so invalidation over time creates confusion, right?
Yeah.
Phew,
Learn
man.
to not trust our emotions. Did I really feel that?
Wow.
Why should I feel that? He was just a
Yeah.
police officer.
Mistrust your
Was
own
it-
reality.
Was it wrong for me to feel that when he said that to me? We start to distrust. We start to do a lot of second
Wow.
guessing, which I think a lot of people of color do. All right.
Yes.
And invalidation can be subtle. We find ourselves saying, well, you know, should I be feeling, maybe I'm overreacting. You know, we start,
Wow.
because
Wow,
we've
wow.
had these repeated experiences.
Yes.
That are and a lot of them are very, very subtle. We have to watch for them. A child that lives with criticism learns to condemn, so we become self-condemning, right?
Yes,
That
absolutely.
is so good.
A child that lives with ridicule, where ridicule and invalidation lives and becomes shy. That there's some of us who've repressed stuff. And we develop a lot of shame-based identity. We feel shame.
Wow. Shame-based identity.
So we have to be able to work at rebuilding our sense of identity. I love Proverbs 25 that says the purpose of a man's heart are deep waters. That and I see that text as really talking about soul, that we're so complex. There's so much in us, these deep emotions and thoughts, these core beliefs we have. And it goes on to say, but those who have insight can draw it out. We need people
with that insight.
Sometimes that's the therapist, or the spiritual leader, or whatever spiritual community you're in. People in communities to help draw that out. That's somebody who's skilled to draw out what is in us. And there's so much in us. Virginia Satir, who was a family therapist, talk about the importance of being seen. She says the greatest gift that you can give someone, you can give me, is to see, is to hear, to understand, and to touch. We give gifts to people when we help them to be seen. We see them. We validate their experiences, and that creates a deep sense of dignity.
Yes.
Do you understand the reaction across this country when we have some of these open and shut cases of Black folk being shot by law enforcement, and then there's no accountability? A jury returns a verdict of not guilty. Do you understand how invalidating the verdict in the Trayvon Martin trial was?
Yes.
And so when you see Black people rise up and other people of color and celebrate, it's because there's almost a cathartic response that,
Finally.
This jury saw us.
Yes.
And every day we have injustice and there's no accountability, it is tremendously invalidating collectively. There's a collective conscious, a collective sense that we share with other individuals who are Black and brown bodies. And so the celebration is not, it's really, people don't understand it. Like when there's a verdict and people are outside and they're applauding, it's because that verdict is validating. It says, I see you, I get you, I understand that this was wrong or this was racially motivated. That's important.
Dr. Walters,
go ahead.
Can you speak to this? Because that's that point is so key. when the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, and
Oh,
we
that's
knew what the
excellent.
verdict was, right? And so many Black people cheered when he was found not guilty, even though Black people thought he was guilty, right? So, and I know you know where I'm going, but I want you to say it because I've been saying it for years, right? So it's a well, I'm just going to let you know what I'm asking. So that's a little reverse of what you're saying. Can you speak to why that happened? Why Black people who think he was guilty, but we applauded his some of us applauded his not
winning.
Guilty. Yes, because it's the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you live in a society where the criminal justice system has shown repeatedly that Black and brown people are by far incarcerated, right? And oftentimes there is no justice and no accountability. And now the table is switched.
Yeah.
Right? And you're right that there are a lot of Black people you talk to who would say that, he was guilty, right? Because the evidence seemed to suggest that.
Right.
But the celebration was more about you see, a lot of things are the symbolism of the triumph of a Black man, or it's almost like the triumph over a system. It's like we beat the system.
Right.
Like the system didn't put another Black man in jail, and then we had a Black lawyer. Well, there was more than one lawyer, but
right.
So it was at the core, when we take the politics out of the stuff, right? At the core, psychologically, that response by Black people was a tremendous validation response. And we see similar responses in the examples I've given, and that O.J. Simpson, that's an excellent one, a flip now. And it's all about dignity and validation.
Right.
Because one of the things in terms of racial trauma that people of color struggle with is feeling invalidated. The criminal justice system is one of the most invalidating when we look at the history of what has happened to Black and brown people. And so whenever you get a trial where it seems like justice is served, man, there's celebration, right? There's celebration. It's a collective sense that Black folk have. It's a collective sense that connects you. And it's like, it's sort of like us versus the system.
I was just thinking that.
The system didn't get us this time. Oh, we got the system. Or the system, okay, all right.
I was thinking that, Dr. Walters. I was thinking that we finally got one over.
Yes.
We finally got one over. Because
what it can do, this is going to take a long time. What it can do over time is something that's significant. It can restore trust.
Yes.
Sometimes you even hear people say, "Oh, my trust in the criminal justice system. Maybe it can restore trust." But we need to see that over time. But yeah, absolutely. So that really, Sharon, is about validation. Really, that's what I'm talking about.
And that was a small glimmer of hope. Even though I had to laugh when Sharon started mentioning it, because I was one that was thinking that he did it, but he got away with it. Yeah. And I wasn't trying to be mean, but it was that small sense of, hey, maybe we can, stand up for ourselves and win. You get that small glimmer of hope that we can, that we're not going to be seen always as the guilty party, guilty just by association of ethnicity, of color, and that they, like you said, they see us and wow, we can actually win something in this government, in this system that has kept us down for so long. And it was like, yeah, we got one over.
I want to read one of these comments. Netta says, it's like they know how we feel now. When OJ, got off, even though many people thought he did it. So it's like now white folks know how we feel.
Yes.
what happens.
Because they were mad and we were cheering.
Right. So, and we get mad when we don't get justice, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, but Sharon, we get mad, but we're so numb to it that we're like, oh, what do you expect? You know, I mean, we're mad, but the level of anger on us was different than the level of anger on them, because it was, if you looked at it right, you could have gone back to lynching because they were so angry. It was like, listen, they're ready to string us up. We happy, but now they probably thinking about stringing some of us up. Whereas we get angry and we're like, yeah, we're mad, but you know what you're going to do? The system is against us.
And one of the things that I think it goes back to the point I made earlier, Mariana, that when something happens, and particularly when it gets national attention, that Black people have there's a sense of collectivity, that we connect with it wherever it is, right? That's our brother or sister.
That's our brother.
And I think we connect that collective sense in the culture that's so rooted in us. And actually, it's like, all right, we're brought to a foreign land. So like, we're all in this, you know, there's that helps. And just think about over time how there can be a reparative element to that, right?
Absolutely.
There is a term was first developed by analysts in the 19th century called corrective emotional experiences, where we can have in therapy that a client can have an experience with a therapist that helps to repair, all right, early experiences in their life that were abusive. But I think over time, there's a kind of reparative element to these kinds of experiences. But of course, it's going to take a while, right? Because there's a lot of, the ledger is still
hundreds of years.
But fundamentally, there's that element. And the point I'm making is that it really is about psychological validation that is important and helps in the healing process. And so the next thing I want to talk about, and Sharon, certainly feel free to let me know when we want to open questions or close them, because I'll just stop.
After this point that you make, we'll see if anybody has any questions, and then we'll wind down for the night.
So the fourth thing I want to talk about is what I call minding the mind. Minding, so mind, I-N-G, minding the mind. And what do I mean by that? I'm glad you asked. Minding the mind really is, in my mind, when I think about minding the mind, what I mean by that is pay attention, to treat it like it matters, to consider or notice, give heed to the mind, pay attention to it. And so we have to mind the mind. One of the ways we're going to heal is by looking carefully at how we think and what we're thinking, right? Mind, we think about this area that's private, what's in our heads. You know, the reality is that nobody really knows what you're thinking. If you don't share what you're thinking, the only person who knows what you're thinking is the Holy Spirit, is God. The mind is the most private part of us. Now, those of us who are trained to do this work, there's some things we've learned, and you know, there are things we know how to do to have some sense of what you're thinking. I could sit with people and have a sense of what they're thinking, but the reality is that we don't know for real what people are thinking. So it's what is in our heads. So we talk about making up your mind or changing your mind. Sometimes we say, you're in two minds, right? So minding the mind is about stewarding the mind. It's about stewarding the mind, paying attention to the thoughts, because racial trauma, what it does is it jacks up our mind, right? Yes. And we have to get to a point where nobody really owns our mind. That's the truth. So I'm going to draw on one of my prophets, the late Robert Nesta Marley. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but yourself can free your mind. We have to emancipate. That word emancipate, of course, means free. Free yourself of mental slavery. You're the only one. None but yourself can free your mind. That we have a lot of thinking in terms of our sense of self and our ability to function in a society that's oppressive and that has not always been kind to people of color. That now we have to begin to address those things. Yes. Can I say to you, if you're watching, don't allow anyone to own your mind.
So important.
You should, this bumper sticker. No squatting on your mind.
Right.
No squatting on my mind. We let people squat.
Yes.
We've allowed the messages of racism and the experience we have to squat.
Wow.
And people stay there without a lease in our heads. And we tell ourselves a lot of things about who we are.
Yeah.
And sometimes we commit suicide.
Yes.
We engage in destructive patterns. By the way, the DSM, not the last one, the DSM-5 added to the diagnosis of PTSD. And I was really glad about this because I saw it before. Destructive self-defeating behaviors as one of the symptoms for post-traumatic stress disorder. So sometimes we wonder when we see these patterns in our community. It's trauma, it's generation, it's trauma, it's system, it's trauma, right? And so we allow the system to tell us things about ourselves. And we believe that, why is it that there's this pattern we see, grandfather, daddy, son. There's a lot of father, son in prison. Daddy was in prison and 2 sons follow. Like, what is that? Generational patterns.
Yes.
Generational curse, which is a captivity in the mind.
Absolutely.
That we become destructive is years of trauma. And we have to mind our mind. There's a hostile takeover of our mind. Slavery was an attempt, and in many ways, successful attempt to hijack. It was a hostile attempt of our minds. A hostile attempt of our minds. And what it did in the slave code, which I don't have any tolerance. I am anti-CRT. Anti-CRT. What I mean by that is those who are anti-CRT, I'm anti them. I'm anti-CRT. Because when we look at where CRT started, by really looking, it was developed, right, in law school, looking at the laws. Well, how do you deny that a slave was chattel? Is embedded in the slave codes, including Caribbean. Chattel, the word chattel, C-H-A-T-T-L, means property. That we were 3/5 of the person, embedded in the laws, in the slave codes. You see this stuff written. That's critical race theory. That's looking at the way in which the law defines who you are. Slavery and the post-emancipation period, the Jim Crow period, was a hostile takeover.
Right.
And now is the time, if we're going to heal, we have to mind our mind. Right? We have to mind our mind. We have to pay attention to what we think, what we believe, and we have to begin to change, right? Don't allow anyone to take over your mind. I like the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who says that man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. And he was really talking about the sense in which a human being, a child, when he or she comes into the world, is really free. But then it's the system, it's society that creates the structure and all of that, right?
Right.
And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was talking about his work on, if you read philosophy, is social contract, right? looking at
Right.
the society. Rosa was saying that essentially man was born inherently good. Now that there's some theological notions that would challenge that, the whole idea of moral depravity, whether we are fundamentally good or evil. I'm not getting into that debate. I'm just saying that Rosa says that we were born with this sense of good, but then there's the pernicious influences of a society, just in chains, and that's this essential element of looking at the way in which a system, what it does to our mind, right? As I said, the reality is that racism has done a job on us here, and we develop, racism and white supremacy leads to, as a result of a kind of caste system of who is here, right? And we see it in colorism, even in Black communities and other communities of color, those that are closer to white are more highly valued.
Exactly.
On my island, they had like what they call a brown paper test. You have to see how closer you were to brown. And we know it happens in many communities across the world. It's colorism, which is a differential treatment for people who of color. Black people are fundamentally treated differently. So the closer you are to white, the more right you are. And so there's this cumulative, this caste system, and that creates a coding, and we develop these schemas, these core beliefs about ourselves, these core beliefs about people, about the world, and that can become very hopeless. I get sad when I see our young men develop hopelessness as a result of years of stuff. And then these core beliefs we have about God, and we might even begin to throw the baby with the bathwater, in which we begin to think of God through the prism of white, because yes, we were taught a white Jesus, God, but we need not to throw the baby with the bathwater. We need to reclaim, and that's going to come by doing a good history and looking at our history, right?
Yes.
The problem is not God. The problem is how God was presented. So we have to go through, going through have you ever can't find something that was valuable? Maybe you lost your ring or something. You think they made it in the trash, and you go into the trash and you pull out stuff, and you're looking for something valuable. We have to go through our history, and we have to go through Scripture and pull out what is white supremacy, what is the distortion of how we're taught about God. And so there's this cumulative effects that happen from racial experiences, right? And it changes. The thing about trauma changes the brain. We know that neurologically, right? And we have to understand Bessel van der Kolk, who I mentioned last week, who I have a lot of respect for. He says that trauma, the imprint of trauma is in the limbic system, in the brain. It's that part of the brain that responds to fight and flight. So why are we always fighting? Why are we always, we're always reacting? We get stuck. Trauma keeps us stuck there.
Yes.
It's in the animal brain. It's not in the thinking brain. So, you see individuals in our communities who, you ever see someone, they're just in a cycle. They just can't seem to get it right, get it together. That's trauma. They're stuck because trauma can't learn.
Right.
Trauma can't learn. And we can't learn if we're stuck in limbic system and we walk around with this stuff in our bodies, right? Because the imprint of that trauma is in the limbic system and brain. So the healing has to come in our mind so we can access those parts of our brain that are more highly developed. And so that's what mining the mind means to me, that we have to be able to get to a place in terms of developing critical consciousness. and an understanding of how racialized experiences have shaped us, and be able to identify those, how it has shaped us as individuals, and how it is passed on systemically in families, and even some of the ways that we parent, right, and group.
Mhm.
In national stories we hear of shootings and all stuff, that we become traumatized vicariously. All of those experiences, understanding how that affects us, that's the critical consciousness. That's part of minding the mind, right? And what it does, and I'm almost done here, Sharon, is that there's a sense of inadequacy that we feel, right? It changes us. It's like we're unsure. There's a term, and when I first learned this term many years ago, it just resonated with me, and I was like, oh my God, that's what I experienced. And there's a term for it. It's called the fraud phenomena, or the imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
The imposter syndrome, or the fraud phenomenon. And what it essentially is this psychological pattern where we doubt ourselves and we doubt our accomplishments, right? We have this internalized fear that we're going to be exposed, like we are frauds. We are brilliant, but we struggle with that. And I realized that was some baggage that I had too. And you know where it happens a lot? In PWI. You say, well, what's PWI? Predominantly white institutions. If you talk to, it happens a lot in academia. So all across this country, I guess outside of HBCUs, if you talk to Black professors and other people of color and hear their experiences in academia, they can tell you about imposter syndrome. And it happens in corporate America. Sometimes you're accomplished, you're competent, but there's this almost sense that you feel that you're going to be found out, that you're not really, you doubt your accomplishments, right?
Right.
A product of being in a PWI, it just happens. Talk to Black intellectuals, talk to Black folk in corporate America, and you'll hear stories. And they may not know this term, but you will see the term in what they describe, right? And so there's that the critical consciousness involves a restore the mind, a deep understanding of how that happens to us. W.E. Du Bois, I mentioned earlier, brilliant book, 1903, Souls of Black Folk. Some of you may have read that. He talks about the idea of this double consciousness that we struggle, that happens to individuals who grow up in systems that are oppressive, who are colonized groups. So we think about all people of color. And what that double consciousness is really this sense of this inner conflict that we have, right? And for people of color, there's an inner conflict. How loyal can I be, for example, it's just illustration, to this country when this happens and this happens and this happens, So there's this inner conflict, this double consciousness as he describes that happens, that it is a psychological mechanism and patterns as a result of racialized trauma, particularly when we think of it at a systemic and institutional level. So the reality is, when we think about minding the mind, it's really about rediscovering who we are, or discovering who we are. Because in some sense, when we came from Africa, we knew who we were, right? And there's that element of that we see in what's the Black movie, superhero movie that came
Black
out?
Panther.
Black Panther, right? That sense of the one who left Africa and came, and those who stayed. We knew who we were, but once we come to the West, all across the diaspora, we have to struggle, and part of systemic and historical trauma is stored in the mind in the mind. So we need this double consciousness, this awareness, and understand that we need to know and embrace our true identity. Part of the healing, really, the soulish and spiritual healing, is going to come when we respond to and answer the question, who am I? That's a fundamental question that every Black person and every person in a brown body has to deal with. Who am I? And what racism does is, and racial trauma, is it forces us to think, like I talk about, our mind, that slavery and all of that stuff has hijacked our minds. And we are the ones, going back to Bob, emancipate yourself. Like, we have to do, every person has to do their work. And some of that work can be done in therapy, but beyond therapy, we have to deal with our minds. And some of it comes, quite frankly, from reading, exposing yourself to critical and to people who know stuff, and beginning to work on this and reclaiming who we are. Who are we on this line?
We have to be intentional about it. That's
right.
We come against the message that racism and white supremacy has given us about our inferiority, that we don't belong here.
Right.
And it starts here, because everything begins and ends in the mind. That is minding the mind. And so I shared with you one, reclaiming and knowing and embracing our history and culture. I talk about the power of telling our storytelling, and the curative and transformational nature of that. I talk also about the power of validation, to validate our experiences, and all of those history and telling our story helps with validation, and then finally minding the mind. And so when we return in the next series, I'll finish two other things before we go on to the body. So I think it's a good time for us to pause. Maybe there's some questions.
Yes, Netta has a question, Dr. Walter. She wants to know if you've ever read How to Make a Slave.
Long time ago.
Any thoughts about it?
Well, it's it really gets at the deep psychological mechanism of, talk about hostile takeover, right?
Right.
What we do to people in the brainwashing. How do you make a slave?
Really insidious.
Stripping one of one's sense of self,
identity.
And that happens in all oppressive systems, really, across history. Not just what has happened in transatlantic slavery in the West, but across history, wherever there have been oppressive systems, slavery, that there is that mechanism. And watch this. It's almost as though, in order to, it's almost something that human beings have to do. So here's the notion, and this is my theory. I believe that in order to treat someone differently and terrible, and even kill them, you have to tell yourself that there are less than you. Because I think to just kill, and there are people who kill for different reasons. We can talk about psychopaths and all that. It's a whole nother conversation. But you see, to deal with the cognitive dissonance, if I'm to eradicate you, I need to tell myself that you are less than. So I need to say that you're 3/5 a person. I need to create a master race and say that you're not what Hitler did to the Jews in that genocide, right? What happened in Rwanda, the same principle where the Hutu, all right, thought that they were better than the Tutsi. All right. So I need to tell myself, and I was in Rwanda, they look the same, right? But there's this sense that you're less than. Well, we do it with women in sexism, right?
Mhm.
We made women less than, and that justifies us treating them differently. So when you look across history, in every period of history, in every oppressive system, whether it's racism, in terms of ethnic cleansing, whether it's sexism, it's almost like human beings have to make the other person less than and create a kind of cap to justify treating them badly.
Which is why I think, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, the Donald Trump's words of like infestation at the border, right? You know, so much like, you know, cockroaches. Yes. So what do you do with that? You terminate them. You terminate infestations. That is dehumanizing language.
Yes, you have to invalidate. You have to make them less than.
Right.
And that's why minding the mind, we got to reclaim that, right?
And you make me think of saying, you know, we have to go from asphyxiation to resuscitation of the mind, because you know, I was like, man, we have been asphyxiated for so long that we're turning into what they used to call back in the day blue babies, you know. So we're so asphyxiated. Yeah, but now we have to go into resuscitation, which part of it starts with, like you said, sitting in somebody's office or laying on somebody's couch and releasing. It's kind of like when a doctor has to relieve pressure in the head. What they have to first do is drill a hole and relieve that pressure, and that's what we have to do in our minds. We have to mentally drill a hole in our head and release the pressure of what's been going on and what's kept us stuck for so long, so that we can resuscitate, so then we can be revised and live.
That's so good.
And by those things, Dr. Walters, that you've been saying, that's how we do that, telling our story, right? Knowing our history and our culture, right? And that's how we do that. But it's again, we have to be intentional about it. And I think that's not what let's just say, as a whole, as far as African Americans, we're not doing that. Because one, I don't even think we know to do that. We don't even realize how much trauma we deal with on a daily basis, because we don't even understand trauma. You know, this is what we've studied, so we understand it, right? I believe this should be general knowledge taught from elementary school through high school, understanding ourselves, and we would have better relationships. We would know how to communicate better.
But on top of that, Sharon, you have to and I'm saying that like just like you're saying, as being in the Black community, that comes with the ability to say there's something wrong with me. And we have taught ourselves to deal with our issues so well that there's nothing wrong with me. I don't need to see nobody. There ain't nothing wrong with me. This is just who I am. This is just the way I act. And it's not. It's an imitation of who you could be. It's all a farce. You're covering up your real pain with, this is just who I am. No, it's not. It's how you're acting, but it's not who you are.
And that's what I'm saying is many people, if not most, aren't going to go to therapy.
Right.
They're going to go to school. Right. So if we were to teach some of this and not, have therapy in school, although, that's a side piece, but just educate young people as they're going throughout school to understand themselves better. And
right.
We would have less crime. We would have less miscommunication, less poor behavior in school. Right. It's not just about the ABCs. It's about life. Right. Not just 1, 2, 3s. I'm sorry, Dr. Walters, what did you say?
I said more self-love.
Right. Exactly. So I'm hoping.
Board?
Say that again.
Any questions that came in?
That was the only one. Netta confirmed what you said. It's like hijacking the mind. So she's agreeing with you. And I don't see any other questions here, other than the couple of comments that she made. And I don't know, Rosie or Mariana, on yours, because I can only see the ones who comment on Full Life. So if they're watching on your pages, I don't know if you guys had any questions from people who watched on your pages.
So let me see. I have the same questions you have from Netta.
Okay. Yeah, and I know you
I
saw
see
somebody watching Rita, but I didn't see
Rita and Letice is also watching. So it's a few people watching, but right now
I can't see them on my screen though.
Yeah. So Letice is watching also. But like I said, Netta's the only one because sometimes a lot of people don't know or are even afraid to ask a question because like I said, even when I was going to make a comment earlier, I'm like, do I put this out there? Yes, I put it out there because this is a safe place
to have a hard conversation.
Have the hard conversation.
But the information that we're talking about and that Dr. Walters is sharing from his expertise, it's just like I'm just soaking it all in. You know what I mean? It's so much to take in. It's like, and people, I hope, are relating it to themselves and how now they can go about their daily lives of telling their story, getting involved in a group or going to therapy, and really being intentional by using some of these tenets that Dr. Walters, are proposing. They work. It's research. He's a doctor. This is research. This is not something that he thought of out of his head. This is his specialty. And so I hope that, ourselves and the audience members are taking this information. And now, not just like you said earlier, Rosie, what is knowledge if you don't use it?
Exactly.
Now we have an awareness, but what are you going to do with that awareness? If you don't do anything with it, it's just knowledge. It's not working for you. We have to start allowing this knowledge to work for us for our benefit. So let's start with reading. Dr. Walters, can you recommend some books that the audience can begin to read? And Mariana, I know you had a book that you had talked about earlier to discuss with Dr. Walters. Dr. Walters, I think you may have even mentioned it last time you were here. So can you share some books with the audience that they can start to read to get to understand trauma, racial trauma better, and what they can do, possibly do about it?
Well, one of the books that I think would begin to, this is excellent to get people thinking about the structure of systems in society, is a book called Caste. I would strongly recommend that. Caste, C-A-S-T-E, by Isabel Wilkerson. And I mentioned last week, the last time we met, Viktor Frankl, the book, tell me, Mariana, I was talking about earlier, Bessel van der Kolk.
Yeah, The Body Keeps the Score.
The Body Keeps the Score. It's a little heavy, but it's good in terms of understanding.
I'm rereading that one right now. It is good.
Yeah. So those are two. Next time I want to talk about some sources around working with the body, but those are places you can begin in terms of understanding. There's
Mariana, can you put the Caste book in there? Because I don't remember.
Yeah.
Also, too, I think it's called Healing Racial Trauma by Sheila Rowe. That's an excellent book. It's an excellent book. So, Dr. Walters, we so appreciate you joining us this evening, and we look forward to July the 6th when you'll come back for part 3. And ladies and gentlemen, Race Matters is moving from Thursdays to Wednesdays starting in the month of July. So next week will be our last show. That will be on Thursday. July 6th, which is a Wednesday, will be our first show. We'll be starting on Wednesdays, and that's when Dr. Walters will be back, July the 6th, which is Wednesday, still at 7 o'clock, just not on Thursday, starting in July. So wanted to let you know that. So any parting words, Dr. Walters, before we sign off?
I just want to say how much I appreciate the three of you for, allowing me to come in and be part of this conversation. This is very special, and I appreciate you trusting me to do this, and I always have a blast with you. And so what I want to say as a closing nugget, and Mariana will know that she probably would hear me say it. It's in my top 10 favorite quotes by Viktor Frankl, who I have a lot of respect for. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. Stimulus is the thing that had happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
So stimulus is the what had happened was, right? The event.
Right.
Stimulus
Yeah.
and response. If you look at my hand, stimulus and response, there is a space. And he said, in that space is our power to choose our response.
Right. Okay.
And in that choice lies our growth and our freedom. Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. The point here is that we have a choice always to choose how we live our lives and what we do with what God has given us and what we do with the things that has happened to us. There's always a choice. And so there's the power of choice. We can choose healing. You don't have to suffer anymore. You don't have to struggle with this. There are resources. There's reading. There's so many resources we have. The power of choice is there. And when you make a choice, that's where your growth and your freedom comes. And so this has simply been a platform for us to engage and provide opportunities for people to make choice. And that's what it is about. Our lives are a series and a collection of stories and a series of choices every day. Every minute of the day, we're making choice. And we're driven by choice. And the question, I love this story that Jesus asked the man who was at the pool and making excuses. Nobody would put me in. Nobody would give me therapy. My insurance don't pay for that. You know, every time I try to go in, every time I try to enter, you know, all the therapists are full.
Yeah.
We have excuses. And Jesus looked at him and says, do you want to be healed? Do you want to be well, really? That's the question for all of us. Do we want to be well? Or do we want to stay stuck in what has happened to us? We can choose wellness. We can choose healing.
Right.
So thanks to all of you for being here. Look
Hey,
forward to
Dr. Waters, I want to throw some letters at you. You know, we deal with CPR, you know, coronary pulmonary resuscitation. Well, we need CPR, cranial psychological resuscitation.
Love it, Ruby. I could trust you to put in some of that medical stuff. I love it. I love it.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Walters, for those parting words. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a choice. Dr. Walters just laid it out.
Yes.
Every day, 24/7, 365, we have a choice. And in our maturity, right, we make hopefully better decisions, better choices. And we can do that by reading and learning and being intentional about what it is that we're doing, because we do have a choice. We don't have to keep doing the same things we've always done. Remember the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing, but expecting a different result. You have a choice. The power is in your hands. The power is in your mind. You can make a different choice today to be better today than yesterday, to be better tomorrow than today.
Right.
It's all up to you. Don't be mentally incarcerated. We may have once been shackled and chained physically. Let's no longer be shackled by our minds. Right? We can take those shackles off. Slavery is over. You have a choice.
Yes, you do.
Do and be anything you want to. But it's all in your mind. So let's be intentional today about how we treat our mind, what we put into our mind. That matters. How much junk are we putting into our mind every day with what we watch, what we listen to, right? Even things that we eat that comes to destroy our physical being, and it affects our brain as well. So let's be more intentional about our thoughts, because our thoughts drive everything. So that's the word for today. We appreciate you. We love you so very much. Join us again next Thursday I think will be the 30th of June for our next topic. But again, join us July the 6th, which will be Wednesday, 7 p.m. And Dr. Walters will be back with us for part 2 of healing racial trauma. Thank you so much, Dr. Walters, for joining us. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, for hosting the show with me. We love you guys. Have a God evening. God bless you. Shalom.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Waters. Oh, my God.